In the Berlin Victory Parade of September 1945, 4 armoured divisions from the victorious Allied nations rolled down the Charlottenburger Chaussee. This gave the Soviet Union an opportunity to reveal their new IS-3 heavy tank to the public and to the West. This vehicle, with a huge 122mm gun, thick slope armour, and a distinctive pike nose, worried the Western Allies. None of them had any vehicles in their inventories or in development that could stand toe-to-toe with the Soviet tank on the battlefield. The 3 Allied nations would almost immediately begin development work on their own heavy tank designs, seeking to avoid being rolled over by the Soviet armoured columns on the other side of the German border. The Americans would address this issue by pushing the M103 heavy tank into production in 1951. The French would adapt their experimental AMX 5100 to create the AMX 5120. Both the Americans and French had armed their vehicle with 120mm main guns. The British, on the other hand, already had in development the revolutionary Centurion tank before the IS-3 was even revealed. At this point in time, however, Centurion only had a 17-pounder gun, with future plans to upgrade this to a 20-pounder, which is equivalent to only 84mm and fell far short of what was required. A completely new vehicle was needed: the Conqueror. Officially designated as Tank Heavy No. 1 120mm gun FV-214 Conqueror, the vehicle was huge. Weighing in at 65 tons, it would be one of the largest and heaviest to ever go into active service in the British Army, and would be the first to be armed with a 120mm main gun. The Royal Ordnance L1A1 was adapted from the American design that would end up arming the M103, as no other gun existed that would meet the standard set. The gun alone was to be 7.5 meters long and weigh almost 3 tons, meaning that a new turret would need to be designed from the ground up in order to be able to wield the L1A1 effectively. A whole new turret was a huge undertaking for cash-strapped post-war Britain, and they still needed a hull and a chassis that would be able to lug the monstrous turret and gun around. Luckily, they already had one. The FE200 project, in development from 1946 and projected to eventually replace Centurion, had been cancelled in 1949. The project did, however, provide the designers of the Conqueror their hull and their chassis, a simplified version of the chassis of the cancelled FE201. The design featured an all-welded hull, 7.62 meters long, 3 meters wide and around 2 meters tall, formed from giant plates of rolled steel armour. The upper plate was between 120 and 130 mm thick, sloped at 62 degrees to give an effective armour thickness of around 300 mm. The lower plate was slightly thinner, at 77 mm thick and angled at 45 degrees with 109 mm effective thickness. The rear plate and the floor were both 20 mm thick, while the roof and sides were thicker at 51. The floor underneath the driver was reinforced with an extra 10 mm of mine plate, and the sides featured 6mm bazooka plates designed to counter shape-charged projectiles. Designers hoped this amount of armour would be enough to nullify the IS-3's 122mm gun. This would, of course, never be properly tested in combat. The driver sat at the front of the hull on the right. The rear of the tank housed a Rolls-Royce Meteor engine that provided him with 810 horsepower and could propel Conqueror up to 34 km per hour on road. The vehicle used a Horseman suspension system, with 2 wheels per bogie and 4 bogies on each side of the vehicle. These use of bogies made maintenance significantly easier and provided a lot more room inside the vehicle for the crew. By 1950, with the gun and turret still in development, a full prototype was a long way off. The Defence Ministry wanted to test the chassis regardless, so engineers created an interim design with the Centurion Mark III turret in order to put the new hull through its paces. This would be known as the FE221 Carnarvon, and 6 would be sent for troop trials. 1 went to the British Army of the Rhine, 1 to the Dragoon Guards, and 2 to the Middle East. The remaining vehicles, including the prototype chassis, were sent to Bovington Proving Grounds. The 2 Carnarvons serving the Middle East would end up completing over 3,200 kilometers running each. Issues to the design were soon discovered and fixed, including changing the driver's periscopes, the driver hatch locking system, and the engine cooling system. Vehicles were also tested with the Windsor ballast turret, a mock-up created to simulate the weight of the final design. It's estimated that testing with the FE221 sped up the Conqueror's development by as much as 2 years. Once Conqueror went into service, all but 1 Carnarvons were converted to accept the new turret. The prototype hull would be used as a testbed for turbine engines, a world first in 1954, and later would appear as a commentary box at the Bovington Tank Museum before being scrapped in the 1990s. By 1951, the L1 had completed trials and was accepted into service. By 1952, 4 pre-production turrets were available. These were put onto the existing FE221 hulls, and at last the first Conqueror vehicles were assembled. The turret itself was a single steel casting, with between 240 and 340mm of armour in the front face, angled at around 60 degrees and providing effective thickness of up to 680mm. Turret sides were 89mm and the roof and rear were 51. A large rectangular plate was bolted on to form the roof above the gun, which could then be removed for maintenance. This turret housed the other 3 crew members, bringing the total to 4. The commander had his own position at the rear of the tank, in what was to be known as the Fire Control Turret, or FCT. This made Conqueror the first tank in the world to feature what is now known as a hunter-killer system, allowing the commander to spot targets independently and take manual control of the turret and gun when necessary. The other 2 crew members sat in front of him, the gunner on the right and the loader on the left, each with their own hatches that popped up and out, one of the first tanks to feature this new hatch design. Conqueror carried 2 types of ammunition in its combat loadout: armour-piercing discarding sabot and high-explosive squash head. Both types are 2-stage, meaning the shell was loaded separately from the propellant. The loader had no easy task, as the APDS propellant case alone weighed upwards of 27 kilograms. Conqueror finally went into service in 1955. The last vehicles left the factory in 1958. In the British Army doctrine, it served a similar role to that which the Sherman Firefly had performed in the Second World War, providing cover for lighter vehicles such as Centurion from afar. Operationally, Conqueror would be placed in overwatch positions, firing over the top of advancing allies at any hard targets they needed destroyed. Most Conquerors went straight to Germany, with a small number remaining in Britain for training and development. From the beginning, it was clear that the sheer size of the tank was going to be an issue. En route to Germany, the tanks had to dismount at every bridge and cross individually, as the bridge could not take the combined weight of the vehicle and the transporter carrying it. The tank had to be driven around with the turret reversed all the way to the rear almost all of the time, to avoid the gun overhanging too much and striking things, or sticking down to the ground when traversing hilly terrain. Somewhat surprisingly, considering the sheer weight of the vehicle, Conqueror was quite a mobile tank. It was able to keep up with the smaller Centurion despite being over 15 tons heavier, and its wide tracks made it much less likely to get bogged down. Unfortunately, mechanical issues would follow the Conqueror throughout its service life. The heavy vehicle put a lot of strain on its Meteor engine, and breakdowns and fuel leaks were not uncommon. In 1959, Royal Ordnance had begun final tests of the now famous L7 105mm gun. It performed almost as well as the L1 mounted on Conqueror, while being considerably smaller and lighter. Lighter enough to be mounted in all future models of Centurion, and leaving no real purpose for Conqueror in British Army doctrine. The vehicle's fate was sealed when the Chieftain appeared in the early 1960s. Significantly more advanced than Conqueror, the Chieftain was faster, better armoured and better armed, mounting the new L11 120mm gun. Its revolutionary Chobham composite armour made it arguably the best tank on the battlefield at this time, and this left no room for Conqueror, which was retired in 1966 after 11 years of service, barely 8 years after the last vehicle had rolled off the production line. After the vehicle was retired, sadly most were used as range targets. One was used as a shape charge test vehicle, testing modern ammunition types against extra armour plates attached to the hull. Sometimes depicted in video games as a Super Conqueror, this vehicle was nothing more than a static test platform constructed of spare parts. Of the 180 vehicles produced, only a handful remain in good shape in museums, most of which still located in the UK. Conqueror, along with the IS-3, M103 and AMX 5120, were among the last heavy tanks to ever go into production. Made obsolete by the emergence of the main battle tanks of the 60s and 70s, heavy tanks were no longer necessary in modern armies. Designed and built for a conflict that never happened, these massive vehicles will continue to serve as reminders of how close we came to annihilation after the Second World War.